So, hi. How is everybody? Awesome. Very nice to be here. I don't think he quite told the story very well. It wasn't as much arm twisting as he... Oh, all right. So I'm Adam Bergstein. Very nice to be here. Thanks to all of you. I appreciate it. This is a fresh, brand new talk just for this camp. So this is we're going to be winging it a little bit here. It's called Restoring Our Lost Imagination. Something that I actually became pretty present to fairly recently, and I'll explain why. So this talk is dedicated to those who are driven to make the world better. And we'll find out why. All right, so first, we have first order of business that we need to cover. So as I touched down, in the airport Thursday night, I got here pretty late. I had kind of a nasty delay and ended up showing up, pretty late in the evening. I was immediately greeted by all of the St. Louis Cardinals marketing material when I show up at the airport. And as a Pirates fan, I sort of found it a bit unacceptable. I already suffer enough trauma from the amount of beatings that team applies to the Pirates. So I got over that with some brisket last night and a couple good beers. And I think we're okay now. But regardless, I'm very happy to be here and to be presenting. And I want to thank everyone who made that happen. So I want to start by setting some context for all of us so we can kind of be present to what this message is speaking to. I want you to pause for one moment and think about a world without any imagination. So just reflect on that for just 1 second. What would this world look like? Could you imagine? Right? So Albert Einstein once said that we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. That kind of stuck with me. I was like, wow, that's a good one. So imagine what problems wouldn't be solved in the world today, right? If no one had an imagination, you couldn't see anything differently at all. So imagine what progress that wouldn't exist if someone didn't push themselves or stretch beyond the norm. Would we have Drupal? Maybe. Would we have modern computing? Maybe. We might not even have electricity. Think of that. Our greatest innovations have been solved by those that have an imagination and want to build a new future. They want to create it. So when I think of imagination, I think of my kids. These two beautiful little girls who bring lots of zeal and creativity into my life, into their lives, into everyone that they touch. They are just these little people with so much to offer. And they play, and they have this beautiful imagination, and it is so awesome, and it has no bounds. Like everything that they do, they bring that same presence to it. They're pure, they're definitely innocent, they're not really rattled by the state of the world or the things that are happening right now around us. I think, especially in this community, there's certainly some unnerving things happening now, and there's a lot going on. So we certainly want to be aware of that. But for my kids, it brings me the utmost joy to watch them on a day-to-day basis, and I never want them to lose touch with that spirit. But having kids has certainly made me realize just how little imagination that I have. And I don't know what happened. Like, when did I lose my imagination? What happened from when I was their age and having a great time to now? I don't know. It never used to be this way. Like, when I was little, I wanted to be a kick-ass Ninja Turtle. Okay? And you could see that. I went all out. All right? So I just don't know where the veering happened. I'm not sure where my course of wanting to be a kick-ass Ninja Turtle changed. Where did this go wrong? I'm doing computer work now. What the heck? So I wanted to find out really what happened in my life that triggered all of this. One thing definitely that is clear is a lack of imagination for me personally has had a profound impact on how I see the world. There's no question about it. And I see the world, sadly, at certain points in time, and I hope you can identify with it. If not, maybe I'm just a jerk or something. But I see the world too much in black and white, or good or bad, right or wrong, us versus them, right? There's all these different, paradigms that are polar opposites, right? But I think one of the things that really is present to me is the fact that I see things as possible or not possible. And that's something that is really challenging. But I want to find out why, and I did a bunch of research, and that's what's going to be presented here today, and do whatever I could to find a way to reestablish my imagination. I want to bring it back. So the first part of research that I did was I read a book called The Last Word on Power. And this was a fascinating book. It was, I think, written, I believe, in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, I can't quite remember, by Tracy Goss. And this introduces the idea of a winning strategy. And basically, the winning strategy is our conditioning. It's the individuality, how we have been conditioned as a person, and it is a de facto way that we have approached the world. It's how we see, it's the lens for which we see the world, right? So this kind of a perspective really forms our reality, and it shapes how we see the world, and it does it in a subconscious way. We're not really fully aware of the influence that our winning strategy has on how we perceive the world around us and the experiences that we have. And each one of us has our own winning strategy. And that reflects how, our lives are set up and what we do. But to quote the book, the winning strategy is both the reason for your current success and your biggest limitation in moving forward. George Orwell has a nice quote that sort of sums up this perspective pretty well. To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle. So if our winning strategy ends up becoming something that's a formation of everything that we have done that has worked for us in the past, right? It's really a tool for us to maintain comfort. And you'll find this word used repeatedly in my talk. Our brains are wired to seek comfort. We avoid the uncomfortable. We just do. And we're not even really aware that our winning strategy exists because it's part of our subconscious, right? As I mentioned. So we're not even really, fully aware that all this processing is happening and that we're seeing the world through this given lens. So the quote is totally perfect. And I like to use the word programming, right? So, we have, in the Drupal community, obviously we have a certain definition for the word programming. But in this context, it's actually more about us. It's how we have been conditioned, how we have been programmed. And, it really reflects a part of who we are. And every single time that our winning strategy wins, our brains get more comfortable and it strengthens. So throughout life's experiences, your winning strategy is always refined and your programming actually becomes worse. So because this influences how you end up seeing the world, you will always carry this bias with you throughout your life, and it all revolves around your winning strategy. And this is the bias that can determine what is right or wrong, good or bad, or possible or impossible. Does it make sense? Cool. So to understand this behavior further, the real thing that we need to get is how are we programmed, right? Before the 1970s, most of the research that was out there in this kind of space prominently focused on data. So how can we create or collect data and analytics and metrics and basically try to predict how a human would act or respond to a situation, right? Author Michael Lewis wrote a book called Moneyball. Anyone heard of it? Okay, cool. And this was basically a success story of how an individual or a collection of individuals leveraged data to develop some models, and they basically used that model for finding who they wanted to put on the field for the Oakland Athletics. And they actually had a film about it, Brad Pitt and that other guy who I can not remember his name right off the top of my head right now. But they did a film on this and basically said, we have this really low budget and we need to figure out how we can find just the right talent that's all going to click and put a good team out on the field. And so they used all this data and this statistical analysis, and they found a set of players that they felt would be good, put them on the field, and they won. They did well. They were successful. But the research in this space had significant flaws, and the mileage definitely varied. There was times when the data, led to good results, and there's times when the data led to really bad results. And really what ended up happening is there was sort of an acknowledgement that, humans, all of us, are basically pretty complex. And sometimes the data-driven models, based on that complexity, they just were completely invalidated. So we know for a fact that there's something more going on here under the hood. And because many of these similar models ended up failing, the author of the book, Michael Lewis, he wanted to find out why. So this quote sort of is a guidepost for this. The human mind was just as bad at seeing things it did not expect to see, and a bit too eager to see what it expected to see. So this quote sort of suggests that how we perceive our lives and the world around us changes based on the context in which we see it. And that's a critical word, context. And it's not just the Drupal module. What was it, back in 6? Yeah, sorry, I'm old school. It basically means that our judgment is individualized, it's circumstantial, and it is what we individually expect. Michael Lewis also wrote, people were also influenced by the world around them in all sorts of ways without being entirely conscious of it. Ooh, that's intriguing. And the last word on power spoke to this phenomenon pretty directly with the concept of the winning strategy, right? So we're actually seeing now some parity between these two completely different lines of research, one being a business-focused book, and now this one being one on the human mind. So for us to recognize our programming that we're bringing forward, we need to better understand what individual circumstances and context we are bringing forward. Michael Lewis ended up writing a book called The Undoing Project, which was a follow-up to Moneyball, but not the follow-up that he was quite expecting, right? So his goal was to respond to what he perceived as the flaws from the research that had been done as part of Moneyball. But Michael Lewis is a storyteller. You can just tell by the way he writes. Like he's pretty good. So it actually is a story of two prominent researchers in psychology, in human psychology, named Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And all they did was basically explore human context in trying to predict decisions. They had a lot of doubts about these data-driven models and these approaches that we talked about because really it just suggested somehow that all human behavior could somehow be modeled by data that was being collected, right? And clearly that was not, to have some doubts is very reasonable, right? So they tried to better understand what was happening with this and when the mind was leading people astray. That was kind of how they were perceiving this. And, they really tried to understand, what were the contexts of these different decision making, right? So some decisions really end up being pretty trivial. So, if I asked you, right, would you like $1 million? What would you say?
Sure.
There we go. That's a pretty trivial decision, wouldn't you agree? Right. But some things are absolutely substantially more subjective. What if I asked you, are you perceiving a threat? Do I get a burrito for dinner? You could have a lot of choices, right? So the key difference here between the trivial and the untrivial is uncertainty. Individuals then tended to rely on their context to make and form uncertain decisions. So this photo here is of a bonsai garden in Asheville, North Carolina. I took it with my own 2 hands. But I want to explore, why do our minds work like this? Why is it that context and uncertainty is such a crazy thing for us to do? And the reasoning is that our minds are constantly trying. They're like little engines, little programming applications that are constantly associating what we see in the world with something that we recognize. We want to find these patterns, and we want to try to say, oh, this is this thing, and this is that thing, because we want to maintain our comfort. But what are we basing this on? What are we basing this similarity on in this context? We need to understand that. It's based on your life's experience. So let's compare a tree. That's why I have this picture here, right? And let's compare a tree to life in general. When it's just sprouted, you may only have a few leaves, right? It's just kind of a little thing, and yeah. But as the tree grows, more leaves will come about, more branches grow, and the tree has more leaves of which to draw from. As you get older, just like the tree and the leaves, you have more experience for which to base your judgments on. And the more connections you make as you age, the more your brain becomes programmed. We classify all that we see in the world around our collective experience in life. And that is the context for which we are performing are constant comparisons. So Danny, one of the researchers, right, had a pretty funny quote. So this is what happens when people become attached to a theory. They fit the evidence to the theory rather than the theory to the evidence. They cease to see what is right under their nose. Funny coming from an academic, right? Sort of sounds like he's spitting in their faces a little bit. So this line of thinking grounded experts everywhere when this research was announced that he did. Basically, they exposed flaws in the human mind, right? It applied to everything. It didn't just apply to psychology, right? Their big claim was even the experts are human. So an individual's mind suddenly became something that could be called into question. And it was all based on one's own individual bias. So Danny said that the stories that we make up, that are all rooted in our memories, effectively replace probability with judgments. So where prominent research theories existed all across the world in math and science, psychology, economics, all these different subject areas, there was now doubt placed based on the human mind. Without this awareness, are the theories reasonable? Or is there some systematic error in place based on the person who wrote it? So Kahneman and Tversky basically tried to explore what are all the different influences that could help to define this phenomenon in the human mind. And they created, they were exploring it constantly. There's probably hundreds of these that they were thinking of, but there was a few prominent ones that I captured here. And they defined a set of rules that drove this similarity comparison that we have in our minds. And they called them heuristics, right? And basically the whole idea is that they took this idea that images of the future are always shaped by the experience of the past. And that was what drove, these different types of heuristics. The first one's representativeness. So the idea here is the more similar that a specific case is to some notion in your head, the more likely that you believe that it belongs to that group or that notion, right? Availability is the idea that you can associate something with anything that you have found memorable in the past, something that stands out and you say, oh, okay, I recognize that, right? Anchoring. So part of their research, which is hilarious, is they had asked people to do certain little tricks, and they would put them in an amount of time. Like, you have to do this in 3 seconds, right? And what they found was there was a phenomenon where they would focus on one specific thing when they were under pressure that wasn't representative of the whole. So they call that anchoring, where you may just focus on one thing that stands out to you and not be present to the entire thing that you're looking at. It's like something standing out. Recency bias is the idea that something that happened fairly recently, is still fresh on your mind, and you associate to it because you remember it readily. And vividness. So something like a car accident, right, is something very impactful for an individual. So something like that might stand out and would give you some sort of bias based on, something that's very vivid and it's not easily forgotten. We often decide that an outcome is extremely unlikely or impossible because we are unable to imagine any chain of events that could cause it to occur. The defect often is our imagination. So we are wired to detect these patterns that are based on similarity, right? We described that. I described it. Hopefully it made sense. So as such, we inherently are limiting our imagination when we don't have similarity. We reject things because it's uncomfortable. Imagine all of the potential experiences and things and opportunities in life that we are not seeing. Just like reflect on that for 1 second. There is probably a whole universe of unknowns that we as individuals can explore if we restore our imagination. So now that we're faced with the impossible, we basically have to retrain our minds. That sounds fun. How do we unlock our imagination? How do we restore it, get it back to normal? Really what we need to do is we need to be able to see these new potentials that we don't see today. And we need to be able to get beyond our own mind's limitations that we are hardwired to do. New realities can be formed, new impossibilities can become possible, and really, it's up to us. Henry David Thoreau once wrote or said, I don't know, it's not what you look at, it's what you see. So let's explore this. It's not just about our vision, right? It's not like, your physical eyes. It's not your sense. It's your imagination and how you're interpreting what you see. So to unlock our imagination, we need to find some tools here to help us change the way we observe the world around us. First one is presence. Your winning strategy, as we described, actually it won't win in every situation. It's not the right thing to do in every single situation you run into in your life. But your mind is constantly going to be seeking this comfort because that's what's familiar to it. So to recognize this bias, you need to be present. And presence means being aware of your words, being aware of your actions, being aware of your listening. It affects your entire being. And this is basically self-awareness, in short. Presence is a tool that helps us to look at any situation and recognize how we would normally respond to it, right? Like if you just, are talking to somebody, what would you say, right out of the gate? Well, if you're more present to what you're saying, you might pause and reflect and then respond. That's being present. We need to be aware of how that affects our state of being. And presence, that awareness, also could help us, instead of seeing things through our lens, maybe we could stop placing value or judgment on the things that we see. And we could say, it just is. It's not good or bad. It's not impossible or possible. It just is. This is what I see. The real challenge here is the discipline to do this. To be present, to pause, reflect, and then act. But that's a tool that you can use. Make sure I got it. Creativity is the power to connect the seemingly unconnected. And that was written by William Plomer. So what about creativity? Do you ever find yourself saying no? Or trying to create some artificial bounds around what you think is possible or impossible? Have you done that before? I have. Probably do it more than I realize. And that's actually normal, right? Our brains are trying to stay very comfortable. And maybe what you do is you're perceiving some risk, or maybe you have doubts about something, or you feel threatened for some reason. But possibly, you're just not thinking creatively. So you need to be capable or trying to recognize when you might be holding yourself back. And try to think of other ways to approach a problem or other ways to see things. Challenge yourself to do that. You may end up unlocking some really cool, new, creative way to approach a problem. Right? Robert F. Kennedy once said, "Only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly." I like that quote too. In The Last Word on Power, they talked about the Japanese samurai, and they had a concept called dying before going into battle. Right? And it was a tradition of theirs before they would go and fight, in a war or do whatever they do. I'm not super familiar with the samurai, I apologize. But this exercise, what it did, was basically it created a sense of detachment from a specific outcome, right? So I think, in life, we often see like, hey, this is the path I want to take. These are the goals I have. This is where I want to be in the future. And you get really focused on that outcome, right? But what happens when you remove yourself from that? When you detach from what you think is going to happen? Maybe you are now free from your own fears. And one of those fears is failure. So for you to unlock the potential of your imagination, you need to not be afraid to do it. It's okay. Failure presents one of the greatest opportunities in life for us to grow as individuals, as people, as professionals, as humans on this planet, right? You may end up dying in battle, but you might survive and you might become a war hero. Or maybe you just cured cancer. Dang. You cannot imagine new realities becoming possible without having the courage to move past what you perceive as a risk and your own inherent avoidance of those risks. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. And that was Howard Zinn. So there's one aspect of this that I really felt was super impactful, and that's around engagement of others and the role of other people in our lives. We should never underestimate the ability for others to help us in our journey. Others may be able to help you unlock new ideas or recognize the bias that you are bringing to your lives. And I don't think this is comfortable for us all the time, for us to really, truly leverage other people. I think we all have sensitivities, and we want to, generally, I believe, people want to be empathetic to others. But really what this requires is for us to listen when other people challenge our ideas. We need to be present to that. We need to accept hard feedback and truly reflect on our own biases as people. And I believe that the others that you speak with, your family, people you work with, your friends, all have a really great role in helping us to do that. Rome wasn't built in a day, right? It's a medieval French phrase that you hear at least 50 times a day, right? And so if you're trying to reimagine or trying to restore your imagination, right? Things aren't always going to come easy. It's going to be hard, right? So you need to be dedicated. You need to actually really stick with it. Because your imagination may delve into new and unexplored territory that doesn't exist today, right? But stick with it. It'll be fun. There may not be quick wins. It might not be easy. But if you dedicate yourself to a new reality or a new problem and you stick with it, even if it gets hard, you'll get there. You'll make it happen. All right. So, hey, we're Drupal. We're a little bit of Drupal. And we kind of have this community thing. So I decided to take this concept to the masses. So what does the community have to say? This is a photo of Jam and Greg Anderson from DrupalCon Baltimore, and I call this photo the meeting of the mustaches. Right? It was fun. I really enjoyed it. I was really enjoying being a cameraman for that. So, like any true researcher, I decided that, hey, we need to get some feedback from Twitter. I posed a slightly related question to this keynote, meant to trigger people's imaginations or their thoughts about it. And I asked a question, when have you accomplished something that you thought was impossible? Right? How did you do it? That was what I posed. Oh, well, hello. I got some responses. Gabor, who probably many of you know from his work in the community, this one, I was like, wow, this is great. I broke it down into smaller successes along the way. I find achievements that lead to the bigger cause, but can already be celebrated to power up. That's huge, right? Sometimes we think things are super impossible and we can't imagine a new future. Maybe we just need to break it down a little bit. That was awesome. He's a smart dude. All right. Jonathan Daggerhart gave some good advice. He says, I kept starting over. Try something. Hit a roadblock. Start fresh. Try to stay out of the rabbit holes and avoid feeling precious about code. I think what he's really speaking to here is attachment. Fail fast. Don't get attached to something. Experiment. Try new things. Do it quickly. Chris Komlanek, this was another really good one. You don't have to know the full path to the desired end to get started. Find a good starting step and take it. Motivation follows action. Boom. That's a John Madden quote right there. Boom. Megan, who many of us know from her work being the director of the DA, if you pick something that you are passionate about, you're more able to push through the hard times to achieve. Also cool. So thank you, Drupal community. That was a fun exercise for me. So I want to kind of get a bow put on this a bit. So I have a summary call to action here. So restoring your imagination is a self-transformation exercise, but it's very much something that you're capable of unlocking all these new realities, both for yourself and things that could become possible based on this new perspective. So we're here at Drupal Camp. So why is this relevant to us? Well, I don't know. It's your own personal journey. But as a community, why don't we try to solve some hard problems? Let's rededicate ourselves as a community to really digging our heels in and doing something completely impossible. Without restoring our imagination, we'll never solve these hard problems, and we subsequently will not change the world for the better. We need to stop seeing constraints. Imagine the state of Drupal as a tool, as a community, and so on, if we all just stepped up our game just a little bit. Just even a shred. Find a way to give back to the community, dedicate yourself to it, and dig your heels in a little bit. It'll help. And you can make the world better by your efforts. And what about you as a person? I will claim that if you restore your imagination, you will help to discover your best you. My best me. Real picture. This self-portrait clearly proves what we can become if we put our minds to it. In all seriousness, the only thing really stopping us from becoming what we see, what we want to be, is ourselves. It's us. We put our own self-imposed limits on our mind based on how we see the world. So ask yourself some questions. What do you want to be doing? What's stopping you from doing it? Change how you see the world. And you may end up winning a Nobel Prize, just like Danny Kahneman did for his research. So a summary, how am I proposing that we restore our imagination? First, recognize your own biases and your winning strategies through self-awareness. Be creative. Eliminate the barriers that you have imposed in your life. Don't fear failure. Engage others to help recognize and help steer you throughout your journey. And dedicate yourself when you start feeling like you're reverting back to old habits or you want to quit or you're not feeling up for it. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I wish all of you well, and have a great Drupal camp.